Swingus. I'm the president of the Press Club. I'd like to thank MAPS for opening this up today. I'd like to thank the City of Green for co-sponsoring this event today, and also I'd like to thank our speaker, John McManus, for sharing his thoughts today, which I'm sure will be very interesting. Also told that he has books for sale, and he will happily sign them. If anybody wants to buy them, they're over at the table over there. A couple of things, Press Club business, and then we'll get started here. For one thing, your support through lunches like this helps us fund scholarships for young journalists and communications professionals, so we thank you for that. A couple of events we have coming up on December 4th at the Tangier. Jason Segedy, Planning Director for the City of Akron, will speak. On February 13th, if you really want to plan ahead, we have the State of the Schools from Akron School Superintendent David James. And then if you really want to plan ahead, on August 30th, we'll have the State of the County speech at the Knight Center from Eileen Shapiro, our county executive. If you want to join the Press Club, I encourage you to do so. You can go to our website, akronpressclub.org. You can also find information about speakers and events such as this. That's about all I got to say. What I need to do next is introduce the Mayor of Green to come up who's going to introduce our speaker. So, Mr. Mayor.
Well, welcome to City Green. For those of you who aren't from Green, I see a lot of friends here, so that's nice. Thank you also to the Akron Press Club and MAPS Air Museum for hosting this event. MAPS is one of my favorite places in Green. This is a wonderful facility. There's a lot of history here. There's a tremendous amount of volunteerism here. I think, not this last year, but the prior year, they had over 50 man and woman years of volunteer service here at the museum. If you don't know, across the way they're restoring aircraft in the hangars over on the other side of the parking lot, and that work goes on continually. A couple of my favorite things within this building, though, is certainly the Hall of Heroes. I think that's what it's called, Hall of Heroes. And there's just a tremendous number of men and women that they've honored in that hall. It's very personal, very unique to those who have served our country. So that is a great place. And from what I understand now, there's a museum upstairs that is now open since the last time I was here, where they have military clothing and other things. And so this place continues to grow. It's an incredible resource for Northeast Ohio, and I'm glad everybody could come. Today we're here to listen to John McManus, who's, I guess, somewhat of an expert in combat. I just met him this week, and his expertise is not from doing combat. I guess it's from researching combat. I just met him this weekend, and you know how you meet somebody and then you see him every day. Well, that's just what it's been. But he spoke at our veterans ceremony on Saturday morning, and then I had the privilege of going to dinner with him that night. So we've had some nice discussions. Unfortunately, the discussions aren't always, some of the things that we discussed weren't always pleasant when you talk about war. But we thank John for coming today. He's gracious enough to speak again to us this morning. John also spent, I guess, a couple hours, 2.5 hours, I hear, talking with seniors at Greenview Assisted Living Center yesterday. And I'm always struck when I go to Greenview, just the percentage of people there who are veterans. I think there was about 14 veterans there at Greenview, and I think there had to have been about 35 widows of former military people there. And so it's always amazing the high percentage of Americans from that period of time who served, and right now, what is it, about 10%? Or even at the Vietnam War, you say it was about 10% of their generation. So certainly the Second World War and the Korean War, in those times, we had a much higher level of participation. So let me tell you a few things about John, and he can actually talk about this. He knows more than I do. But John is a professor, an award-winning author, and a military historian. He is a distinguished professor of U.S. military history at Missouri University of Science and Technology. Dr. McManus is one of America's leading experts on the history of modern American soldiers in combat and has written numerous books on the subject. His most recent publication is Deadly Sky, a book about World War II airmen. John frequently serves as an expert for film documentaries. A veteran of many battlefield tours, he has traveled thousands of miles to give lectures on military history and to research the realities of combat experienced by American soldiers. So at this time, I would ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. McManus to the City of Green.
Thank you, Mayor Nuggebauer. I appreciate it very much. Bruce, I'd like to thank the Akron Press Club for hosting me here. I'd like to thank the MAPS Museum folks for allowing us to have this event here. I love this museum. It's incredible. It's my first time here, so I've been like the proverbial kid in the candy store, of course. I'd like to thank my old buddy Dave Cohen for masterminding this whole thing. So if I screw this up, which I probably will, you can blame him. He should be blamed for a lot of things, including that. And I'd like to thank his wife Dawn also for hosting me this weekend. It's been great. The topic at hand. What I want to give you a sense of today is a glimpse into the world of aerial combat for the Americans who were part of it in World War II. So much as this is possible in a lecture format all these decades later, a bit of distance obviously separating us from the event. Nonetheless, we can get a sense of that, and I want to give you sort of the feel and flavor for that book that I wrote called Deadly Sky, the American Combat Airmen of World War II. And I really hope to convey the idea that in World War II, aerial combat was neither glamorous nor glorious. It was completely different than is portrayed in many of the video games or in some of the movies on the topic. It was a bitter, bitter grind. Most of the young men who were attracted to combat aviation were attracted because of what they perceived as the glamour, and what they perceived as something different from the arduous and wasteful nature of ground combat, some of which many of them had read about in World War I. So they're attracted to the air arm, which is still sort of the new kind of service at that point. And they find that they are literally fighting for their very lives up there. These were very, very young men who were combat aviators in World War II on the American side. And by young, I mean 19 to 22 years old, typically. If you were a 25 or 26-year-old on a typical bomb crew, you were jibed about being the old man. You were told you were called grandpa. They would offer to help you in and out of the plane, So these were young guys, and there was a reason for that. You needed to have that kind of visual acuity that you would have when you're in your late teens or in your very early 20s. The physical fitness, of course, but there was something more than that. You needed to have that daredevil quality that young guys tend to have, the idea that they're indestructible. When you get a little older, even by the time you're in your mid-20s and later 20s, the perspective tends to change a little bit. So it was no accident that they wanted young guys. And as I mentioned, the reality that they found was grim. So during my research, I found a diary entry that I tend to think conveys a lot about the human cost of war, of course, but also something very typical about the experiences of those who fought the war in the air. The diary belonged to a young man, a navigator, Lieutenant Joel Burns, B-E-R-N-D-T, who served in the 490th Bomb Group that was part of the 8th Air Force in England. And one night he sat in his barracks and he watched grounds crewmen from headquarters remove the personal effects of a buddy who had been killed that day in a mission over Germany. And this was a standard thing. When an aviator was killed, they would pack up that person's effects. They would be sent home, usually to the Army's, because the Air Force was part of the Army in World War II, the Army Air Corps Air Force. And they would send it to the Army Quartermaster Effects Bureau in Kansas City and chronicle and document everything that was there, and then they would send it on to your family. So Burns is watching the crewmen put the effects together of this buddy. And this is what he was motivated to write in his diary. He said a few days ago he was like you and I are, and now he's no more. His name will appear eventually on a list with a lot of other fellows just like him. And probably thousands of people will read it. What will it mean to them? Do they realize the story that lies beneath that simple announcement? Can they visualize his wife when she receives the telegram? bearing that simple but most tragic message. The Army regrets to inform you that your husband has been killed in action. It means that another wife must start life anew without the presence of the man with whom she promised to go through life. And it means another son or daughter will never see their father. It means another young man will never be able to do the things you and I do every day. And I tend to think that that encapsulated a lot. That every combat airman, including Burns at the time he wrote this passage, faced that distinct possibility of ending up in the same situation as that anonymous dead flyer. And that disturbing reality is at the core of the combat experience, both its drama and, of course, its tragedy. So if you were to ask an American combat airman in one word what that experience of combat was like, you would probably get the following answer, if the person's being honest: fear. Overwhelming fear. And of course, everybody experienced the emotion to a different degree. Some to a lesser degree, but for most all of them, the fear was ever present in everything they did. It was with them as they ate their meals, as they played cards, and they lay in bed, especially when you were alone with your thoughts, what could happen, what had happened, how you would survive to that point. One veteran wrote that in the officers' club at his base, where pilots would congregate, you could almost smell the fear in the chairs, the walls, in the bar itself, that it had a distinct pungent smell and odor. It was with them when they sat at their pre-mission briefings. It was with them as they went over their checklist before takeoff, as they lifted off the runway, whether paved, dusty, grassy, all over the world, wherever they would have been. It was certainly with them when they flew into enemy skies, but ironically enough, the one time the fear might not have been present was when they were actually doing their jobs. When they were in combat and when they weren't necessarily in a place where they could think about and reflect. When they were just focused on doing their jobs. So that was true, I think, fair to say, for a guy named Charles Nickel, who was a fighter pilot in the 348 Fighter Group, who wrote to his sister that, quote, "On the way home from a fight is when most people get nervous, especially me. By the time I land, I'm so nervous that my knees are shaking." This was the perspective of a fighter pilot. When he was actually flying the mission or in a dogfight or something, he had no time to reflect on such things. It was later. And of course, this was a generation of men who readily admitted to having fear. It's quite different than like the Civil War era, in which fear was almost equated with cowardice. And so if you study like the Civil War combat and that generation, the effect on them, in many cases, they're having to kind of come to terms with the idea, well, I'm scared, and yet I do my part in battle. So how do we reconcile all that? I'm not a coward, I guess, but what does all that mean? By the time of World War II, most are readily willing to admit that fear. There isn't that stigma. So those who claim to have no fear were usually described by World War II era soldiers as liars or lunatics. You very often hear that. Some chose to cloak that fear, though, being young men, behind bravado. The Air Corps recruiting poster image of the devil may care flyer image, an image that led many of them toward aviation in the first place, that seemed so cool, to use the word of the later generation. The word they would use in World War II is swell. That word has gone out of style, but that's what they would describe the same thing in World War II. So they would have put on an air. Ben Smith, an example of that. He was a B-17 radio operator in the 303rd Bomb Group, and throughout his entire tour of duty, he was just tormented by fear. He remembered he used to lay awake at night, dreading the next day's mission. Fear gnawing away in the pit of his stomach, and had a feeling, in your gut, this queasy feeling, thinking about what he might face the next day. And here's what he wrote about it after the war from the perspective of middle age. Outwardly, I was lighthearted and jovial, but inside I was sick, sick, sick. My bravado was sort of a rallying point, though phony as a $3 bill. I wore a hot pilot's cap, I smoked big black cigars, and I drank Boilermakers. The only one who wasn't fooled was me. More commonly, though, combat airmen didn't necessarily run from fear and put on that front. They embraced it in an effort to carry out their dangerous jobs. The vast majority would have agreed with this statement by Captain Charlie Dryden, who was a fighter pilot with the famed 332nd Fighter Group, commonly known as the Tuskegee Airmen. These are African-American fighter pilots. He said, true courage is best demonstrated by someone who is scared half to death, but who presses on and does the job that has to be done in spite of his fear. And so Dryden saw it, and how thousands of others saw it. So a bomber crewman said the same thing. I mean, these guys were there, I wasn't, so here's their sentiments. Survival instinct takes over, you react to the situation, do what's necessary. You get an exhilarating feeling, it gives you an added strength and purpose, and it all takes place in a couple of seconds, like that. So in that sense, fear became productive. Airmen knew it was inevitable, and were determined to just not let it conquer them. So what was this combat they faced? What was that like for them? What typified it for Americans in World War II? In a blanket sense, obviously the word terrifying comes to mind, but beyond that, combat and your experience in combat had a lot to do with whatever your specific job would have been. When I say combat aviators, in the book Deadly Sky, I'm generally talking about bomber pilots, bomber crewmen, fighter pilots, perhaps transport crews and pilots who are definitely on the sharp end of war. And really one of the compelling aspects of all this is that when you study combat, no two individuals tell you the exact same story. And the way they perceive it, of course, is very different. You and I could be standing next to each other in a combat situation or whatever, and we see it different and describe it differently, like accident reconstruction or witness reports or whatever it be. But stepping back from it years later as a historian, you can identify some patterns. When you look through the various testimonies. So you can make some generalizations. Bombers. What was it like to be a bomber crewman and to be a bomber combat crewman? Well, it's obvious, but from the start, it has to be stressed that the entire purpose and existence of you as a bomber crewman is dropping bombs as accurately as possible on target. It wasn't, World War II technology was such that it's not that accurate by later standards. The RAF found in its bombing campaign in Germany that if they could get a bomb within 3 miles of its intended target, they were doing well. The U.S. Army Air Force felt that it could do that much better with something called the Norden bomb sight, and I noticed a diagram for that in the Hall of Heroes there. And it's a really neat diagram. I encourage you to take a look at it, and what they would say is you can drop a bomb in a pickle barrel. That was silly. That was a manufacturer's turn of phrase, of course, but the Norden bomb sight did allow you a greater accuracy than what the British had. That perhaps you could get within a half a mile or whatever of your target, depending upon conditions. But as you know, that's the whole purpose of why you're there, to drop bombs on target. So every member of a bomber crew, whether carrying out missions against strategic targets like enemy cities and factories and whatever, or tactical targets to help ground troops, like in the Battle of Normandy, they use heavy bombers to blast a hole in the German lines so that you can have a ground offensive through there. Every bomber crewman had the job, though, of carrying out that bombs on target strategy. Pilots did the driving, right? And they tended to be the commanders aboard a plane. You would have on any typical bomber a pilot and a co-pilot. You'd have a navigator. You'd have a bombardier. You would have a complement of crewmen who were usually gunners, but you had a radio operator. You had a top turret gunner who was also like your engineer, crew chief too. So that was usually the kind of mechanical genius of the crew quite often. The guy who would have been a grease monkey in civilian life kind of thing. And and you see these guys, they have a lot of rank, especially by infantry standards. Staff sergeant and up, technical sergeant, a few master sergeants, and of course then the bombers, the bombardiers, the navigators, the pilots were all officers, most of them. So bomber crews could be anywhere from 6 or 7 people to about 11. It just kind of depended what plane you were flying. If it was a 4-engine bomber like a B-17 and B-24, it tended to be a bigger group of people, 10 or 11. And you face 2 perils over enemy skies: fighters and flak. Enemy fighters in the European theater, the German fighters became kind of legendary. For nearly a year, during the American Daylight Bombing Campaign, you've got a lot of bombers flying unescorted to targets deep in Germany. And this was very deadly. You're going in without bodyguards. You are flying a very heavy aircraft in the sky, heavily laden with bombs, and here come these very maneuverable, fast fighters trying to shoot you down. So 2 things helped alleviate the German fighter threat in the long term. The advent of long-range American fighters themselves, you may have noticed as you were driving in here, the plane that is mounted like on a stand somewhere near the entrance, it's a P-51 Mustang, and that's a classic example of a long-range fighter that was fitted with drop tank fuel tanks that would allow the fighters to stay with the bombers longer. Also, over time, the bomber force and their fighter escorts really sort of wore down the German Air Force over time and warded off some of that fighter threat. But this is an example of what you might have seen if you were one of these guys during your tour of duty. There's a guy named Merle Perkins who after the war became a professor of linguistics, I believe it was, at University of Wisconsin. But when he was a radio operator in the 483rd Bomb Group flying out of Italy, he kept a very vivid diary. He remembered one day over Merseburg, he remembered the enemy fighters systematically, in close arrowhead formation, cannons and rockets firing, swarms of 6 fighters at a time would curve into the lowest box of bombers. After 6 of these attacks, that squadron's planes and crews, 70 men, were gone. 1 plane exploded, another was shot to pieces, the 3rd went into a spin. That's what he just remembered from that single day. He, by the way, was the only surviving member of his crew. He got sick or something like that on the day when his crew still went and flew its mission, and that day they got shot down and they were all killed. This is a tail gunner, John Gabay in the 94th Bomb Group. And if you were asked in World War II, you're a pilot, if you could only have 1 gunner on your plane, which would it be? Probably pick the tail gunner because he's protecting your blind spot. What the aviators would call it your 6. So this guy was a tail gunner, and you remember an enemy fighter attack over Kiel, a city in northern Germany. 4 of them attacked our ship from the tail, 1 at a time. Flame from their cannons, tracers from their machine guns, rockets from under their wings made the situation a bit hairy. All I could do, besides being scared, was to spray each one as they came in and then call for evasive action. At times, and this wasn't that common, but sometimes the gunners would come face to face with enemy aviators. And usually the air war was a little bit more distant, physically distant, but in this case, this is Jack Novy, who was a 19-year-old waist gunner who got through a 25 mission tour of duty with the 8th Air Force at a time when this was almost statistically impossible, throughout the first half to middle of 1943. And he remembered an encounter with a German fighter pilot who was coming straight at their plane. And he said, I swear that if my gun had been 3 feet longer, I could have touched the fighter with it. And he had a .50 caliber machine gun, a fearsome weapon. I could see the pilot looking at me through the canopy. I let loose a burst. Shells exploded around the cockpit. The pilot blew his canopy and ejected, and his suit was on fire. His parachute opened up, burned away in an orange-yellow blaze, and he came out mouthing a scream. It took me more than 30 years to forget that horrible moment, and I can only hope the pilot was dead before he started to fall in flames, but I don't think he was. In the Pacific, Japanese fighter resistance was not quite as intense as that, but it's something you would have had to deal with. The fighter planes, especially during the missions over Singapore or the South Pacific and whatever, this is one fighter or bomber pilot remembered. One fighter came up from below, laid an explosive shell in my nose wheel. It's hard to say. Damaging both tires, tearing away the linkage on my throttles, blowing a hole through the side of the fuselage. Another fighter came up with an explosive shell, put a 9-inch hole in the top of the left wing above a gas tank. Somehow his plane held together and he lived home. He was on a B-29 bomber. So that's the kind of thing you might have faced. But more commonly, you're going to face flak. That's like anti-aircraft fire. And if you've seen documentaries from World War II, you may have noticed, the kind of puffs, the black puffs of smoke, oily black smoke that's there, and the sky just seems to be covered with it. And the typical term you would hear from these guys, the flak was so thick you could get out and walk on it, and obviously there was a bit of hyperbole, but it was thick. And this is most feared than anything. It's a fighter, you could fight back. You could see a target and shoot at it and maybe hit it. Flak, there wasn't a lot you could do. You would fly, and you would be like the duck in the shooting gallery. And either the flak hit you, or it didn't, and if it did, maybe it wouldn't do damage, maybe it would. Who knew? So that could work on your mind. Can you imagine that? And you're like, when's the next one going to be? When's the next, especially like when you're between missions. When's the next time the flak is going to get more accurate, or I'm going to lose my luck, So some crews tried to take evasive action against flak, but that produced mixed results. Usually bomber crewmen had no other choice but to fly through it. Especially when they were what was called the bomb run, or the initial point. At that point, the bombardier, once the bomb bay doors are open, the bombs are armed, the bombardier would take over control of flying the plane as he vectored in on the target. And you can imagine you've got a bomb bay full of live bombs, and you are flying through that thick flak over the target because the Germans or the Japanese know what you're trying to bomb, probably, and they've protected it. So it took a lot of guts to do that. So if this worked on your mind, this idea of flak, you became known as flak happy. And that's just another sort of aviator's term for what we call combat fatigue or PTSD or nerves or that kind of thing. Same kind of thing. It's one of the reasons why you would get an R&R in the middle of your tour, ideally. You just go and decompress. So flak was usually thickest and dangerous in the European theater, but it could be in the Pacific theater too. One pilot from the 15th Air Force in Italy wrote to his parents, "Flak really gets on a guy's nerves at times. When you approach a target, you look out ahead and see the entire sky filled with those little black puffs of smoke. When you're about to enter it, you start praying and trying to convince yourself that your ship won't be hit. And at the same time, they're coming so close, the explosion of the shell is heard even above the roar of the engines." So that's close, And again, there's not that much way to evade it. I would say the chances were on your side. So from a German gunnery standpoint or a Japanese gunnery standpoint, these bombers were hard to hit and hard to bring down. But still, if there's enough going up there, something or someone's going to get hit. So flak tended to be the kind of thing the aviators just sort of, they'd grin and bear it. What if you were a fighter pilot? Well, most fighter missions in World War II fit one of three categories. Air-to-air encounters or dogfighting, which is one of the reasons you wanted to be a fighter pilot, to be a glamorous ace and all that kind of thing, carrying on the World War I tradition. Strafing of ground targets, and then escort missions for the bombing missions that I was just talking about. So, one thing to understand is fighter pilots were a different breed. They thought of themselves as the best pilots. It didn't really mean they were, but they thought of themselves as that. I would say probably 60 to 70% of those who went into pilot training wanted to be a fighter pilot. That wasn't going to happen for most. But when you're a fighter pilot, you're flying the hottest aircraft. It's the most fun to fly. It's like sports cars in the air kind of thing. And you're your own bombardier, you're your own navigator, you're your own pilot, you're your own gunner. So you had to have a bit of an independent streak. And the Army Air Force and the Navy too would do really extensive personality profiles on people to see where they would fit best. But you become a fighter pilot, say. What would dogfighting be like? Well, most of them preferred that kind of mano-a-mano combat. And they liked the idea of fighting an enemy pilot to the finish. They saw that as a chivalrous war too, though it wasn't always. They relished the idea of sweeping enemy fighters from the sky and becoming an ace, and that was the romance of the thing. Francis Gabreski was one who became an ace. This guy had a fascinating story, but to encapsulate it for you, he was at Pearl Harbor as a fighter pilot, and then later becomes a fighter pilot in the European theater, becomes an ace, and he remembered this encounter shooting down an enemy aircraft. I picked out a straggler and opened up on him at 600 yards. He was still carrying his belly fuel tank, which made him unwieldy and vulnerable, and it burst into flames when my shots hit it. I was dead astern when I opened fire on another one, carrying its belly tank. Again, it burst into flames, which was another sure kill. It was just another day at the office for him, kind of thing. He ended up shooting down, I think, 20-something enemy aircraft. The other thing, the postscript about Gabreski. He finished his tour of duty, and he was set to go home. But he still had the itch to fly, and maybe get another victory and all this, so he decided to fly one more mission. Well, what do you think happens on that mission? He gets shot down, and he ends up as a POW for the rest of the war. Jack Conger was a Marine fighter pilot in Guadalcanal in the Pacific. His experience shooting down a Japanese plane belies the notion that these were anything other than nasty duels to the death in the air. I fired not more than 20 or 30 shots, but they were all smashing right home into him, and he blew up all over the sky. I saw the pilot blown up 30 feet into the air, and the chute he had didn't open, and then he dropped. And I watched him hit the water. That was an encounter for keeps. The second kind of mission, strafing. Even worse and much more feared by enemy fighter pilots. Let me give you an example of the attitude about strafing. One pilot remembered that, during when you'd have a briefing Sometimes there would be chapel services, pre-mission chapel services that the chaplain would carry out. And if you had bomber escort duty, almost no one would be in there because those were not perceived as deadly missions. If you had air-to-air, there'd be some people in there. If you had strafing missions, the chapel would be packed because strafing missions were very, very deadly. You're flying low, you are very vulnerable to enemy flak and other ground fire, and you may get power lines, you may become disoriented, but if you're hit, it's not like you can really get out of the aircraft and parachute to safety. You're probably crash landing or just blowing apart. So strafing, though airmen embraced it as an important mission, it was pretty dangerous. So this is an example of the kind of thing that might have happened to you as a fighter pilot strafing. This is Quentin Anensen, the 366 Fighter Group. And if you, by the way, if you've ever seen Ken Burns' PBS series on World War II called The War, Quentin Anensen was one of the featured people in that series. He came from the town in Minnesota. That's one of the 4 towns that's featured in that series. So anyway, he remembered one day he was called in to provide cover for an infantry company that was dealing with a German tank attack. Okay, so he has to fly low to try and strafe these German tanks, but they're interspersed almost with the U.S. soldiers. So you're talking about a situation in which possibly you might drop your bomb or strafe your own guys. So he remembered he screamed down at the enemy tank. He said, "I can see the tank all the way. Made my dive as slow as possible to try and improve my accuracy. I was scared to death. I might overshoot and hit our guys, but I can't describe the feeling I had when I looked back and saw the German tank on fire, totally out of commission." The infantry captain was on the radio shouting with excitement, and I could see some of his men waving at me. There's almost like a Twilight Zone postscript to this story. After the war, Anensen was in college, and he had, there were many other veterans, of course, whom he knew, who were buddies of his fellow students. And he was having, I don't know, dinner or drinks with one of them one time, and this guy had been an officer in the ground combat arms in the European theater, and Quentin didn't even know this, and this guy didn't know Quentin was a fighter pilot. They got talking, and they got talking about their most vivid day in combat, and Anensen described this moment, you know, when he had helped this ground unit. And the captain said, "You know, we had an incident exactly like that." And then they went deeper into the story and realized that Anensen had helped this guy's unit. What are the chances of that? Isn't that freaky? And so obviously that's something that stayed with him a long time. So as much as fighter pilots dreaded strafing missions, they knew they were important. You were helping your own guys, you know. Same with escort missions. Probably the safest duty for you as a fighter pilot, but I will tell you this. If it comes to it, you are the bodyguard for the bombers. The bombers are the purpose and strategy of this whole thing. They're the valuable aircraft. You're there to protect them. So, just like a bodyguard protects a president or whatever and has to sacrifice his or her life, you are expected to do that as a fighter pilot if it means saving the bomber to bomb on target. So, glamour, not so much. Dedication, yeah. So escort missions were very, very common, especially as the war wound down and you had more range to do this. So it basically entailed liaisoning with the bombers and then flying in a tight formation fairly close to them, and then peeling off to deal with enemy fighters or whatever. And there are various tactics I won't bore you with about that. But Ed Gleed, I think, had a pretty good description of this. He was also a Tuskegee Airman, and he remembered shooting down a German plane on an escort mission in the summer of 1944. You break down into basic elements of 2, and your wingman tries to help you out, so you protect each other. And I was busy trying to keep from getting knocked out. At the same time, I was on the tail of a Messerschmitt 109. I had to follow right down to the deck to get him knocked out. So that was what became a very typical workaday experience for him, though I would think most of the time you're not necessarily encountering enemy aircraft, but still you're in protection mode. The other thing you might have had to deal with now, if we're thinking beyond the kind of stuff that, beyond the typical missions and what could happen and did happen, bomber crews, after they went to the target and dropped their bombs, had the job of checking the bomb bay to make sure it was clear of all the bombs. And sometimes they weren't. So when a bomb didn't drop, they had to expel that bomb any way they could. You were not going to be able to land with a live bomb in your bomb bay. And of course, the longer, let's say you're on a mission, to Germany or something like that, and you're flying back to England, the longer that bomb's in your bomb bay, the better chance you're going to drop it over friendly territory. Okay? So you would have somebody on the crew, usually the radio operator, maybe a waist gunner, possibly the top turret gunner or engineer, but their job would be to go and get the bomb out of the bomb bay. Jack Novi was a waist gunner, I mentioned him earlier. He remembered an incident where there was a 500-pound bomb hung up in the bay. And the bomb bays in World War II had very narrow catwalks, so you couldn't wear your parachute when you're in the bomb bay. So you've got a 500-pound bomb that's hung up there on the racks. It's armed, because you've had to arm it. The bombardier has armed it, to prepare for the bombing. And it's begun, the bombs had these little propeller mechanisms on them, and a certain number of revolutions, then the thing could explode. Okay, so it's basically in the wind, and you're talking about way up at altitude. So here's Novi and this other guy who are now taking turns trying to kick the bomb out of the bay. Kicking a live bomb out of the bay. Meanwhile, the bomb's propeller is spinning. Both of them pass out from lack of oxygen, because you can't be on an oxygen line when you're doing this. You have a bottle, but that's unwieldy. And finally, one of them wrapped his arms around the catwalk, crawled over close to the bomb, and kicked it out. This is what Novi wrote. I think this is amazing. I love this writing. Even now, many years later, telling this story sets my heart pounding again. Imagine, it's like a bad dream that was real. So let's think about this a second. No parachutes, sub-zero temperatures, only walk around oxygen bottles, hanging about 5 miles above the earth in an open bomb bay, kicking loose an armed bomb that could explode at any moment. Anybody want to sign up for that? Any volunteers? That's the kind of courage, but there's nothing special about these guys. They're like you and I. They happen to be in that situation, but very, very young, right? Another issue you face is oxygen deprivation, and I don't pretend to be an expert on that. So I'm going to say it's often called anoxia, hypoxia, whatever you want to call it. But over 10,000 feet, most of these are unpressurized aircraft, so you got to be on oxygen. Okay, so that caused a lot of problems. If you were part of a bomber crew, you're supposed to be on oxygen over that altitude. And so everybody's supposed to report in from their station. The waist gunner, the tail gunner, the ball turret gunner, whatever. And why? Because you're out there on your own, and your line could come loose, and you could basically die of oxygen deprivation before anyone realizes what had happened. And that happened a lot in World War II. So typically, the way this would occur, more so than the line getting broken or something, is that at altitude like that, it was so cold, your exhalations have moisture, and you can see that especially when it's cold in the winter. Well, that can then cause ice crystals and then choke up your oxygen line, and then you don't really know it. You just pass out from lack of oxygen. But in some cases, among the survivors, they would leave us testimony of how they felt before they almost died. And there would be like a giddiness, the euphoria from oxygen deprivation. So, examples. This is John Williamson, who was a bomber pilot, 461st Bomber Group, and it happened to him one day. His mask got loose and off kilter. And he said, I remember trying to touch our wingtip to that of the lead plane in our box. Can you imagine that? Touch the wingtip. A feat that seemed inordinately amusing to me. When the euphoria suddenly stopped, something made me glance down, and I saw the nose of my oxygen mask dangling free, and I passed out. Well, his top turret gunner happened to realize what was going on, revived him, put him on an oxygen bottle, and he was fine except for a very splitting headache. He survived. It could happen to fighter pilots too. This is Lou Purnell, the 332nd Fighter Group. He said, all of a sudden I felt like this is the best day I'd ever lived in my whole life. I could hear music coming out of nowhere. I wanted to roll back the canopy and climb out on the nose of the plane and direct 64 pieces of an orchestra. Then I began to get really sick to my stomach. In his effort to do the things that should have been second nature, pulling back on the stick or whatever, I had a feeling as if I was going to sleep. So he realizes what's happening. He takes action to correct the problem. He's a survivor, but sometimes the fighter pilots, you didn't know it was too late. So you might see a formation of fighters flying at 15,000, 20,000 feet, and then all of a sudden one of the fighters just goes out and just plummets to the ground because the guy never revives or whatever. So that was another thing you might have dealt with. The other peril that I kind of alluded to, the extreme cold. And this is true if you flew in a B-17 or a B-24 bomber. You know, you're talking about altitudes of 25, 30,000 feet. Not only do you have to be on oxygen, it's freezing cold up there, even in the summer. It's anywhere from -20 to -40 degrees below zero. So frostbite and hypothermia were really constant dangers. If you're one of those airmen, especially a waist gunner, where especially in the early model B-17s and B-24s, they're not enclosed, so you're just with your gun and the whipping wind around you. So you dress in layers, heavy layers of clothing. You had heated flight suits. It was called a bunny suit, and it had this sort of almost like blue t-shirt that had wires in it. Then you have the heavier padded clothing, the padded headgear that you would have, all of that kind of stuff. But you know, the problem was they often shorted out. And in the best case scenario, it shorts out and it's just, okay, you got clothing on rather than the heated suit. But far too often, they caught fire, which was not a good thing, obviously. So you might be standing there at your gun, and then you see some smoke coming up, you're like, oh, my arm's on fire because my heated suit has caught fire. So these were not particularly good pieces of equipment. And if you were especially a waist gunner, you had to really be careful about this. So this is one waist gunner he wrote. It's the kind of cold that creeps into every pore of your body and freezes the sweat on your back. You pull off your glove and touch the metal of the plane, it'll take the flesh off your fingers. If you had to pee, urine freezes before it hits the fuselage floor. Gross, I know, but that's what it was. Our primitive electric suits, all the heavy clothing we could put on just barely kept us from freezing to death. The cold hurt. It penetrated with an intensity that was the same as pain. The cold was like a serpent crawling over my body, enveloping and numbing my mind, roaring into my ears, let me in and I'll kill you. That's what I remembered about the cold. So you may wonder, why in the world do these guys do this? You know? And this is part of what animates me as a military historian, to get at the core of combat motivation, why people do this, not just why they sign up, what sustains why they do this. Well, Army Air Force psychiatrists studied this very question in the summer 1944. And they found that in almost all cases, battle-hardened combat airmen carried out their duties mainly for their comrades. The idealism had gone out the window, the glamour was gone. Everybody believed in the Allied cause, I guess, in their own way, but that's not why they were going up there, because they didn't like Nazis or Japanese militarists or something. No, that wasn't really it. Over and over, they wouldn't shirk their duty, they told the psychiatrists, because, quote, it would let the other men down. It was true for fighter pilots, it was true for all kinds of combat airmen, because the vast majority, of course, were volunteers. Most are highly trained specialists who took professional pride in carrying out their duties, you know, and especially pilots. But when their lives were in danger, that wasn't enough. It wasn't their primary motivation. So it's a complicated blend of teamwork, especially on a bomber crew, but also fighter pilots, flying in tandem with each other as wingmen, as part of an element, a squadron, whatever. It's definitely that. The teamwork, it's peer pressure. Peer pressure is such a potent thing for well or ill. It's the peer pressure of, hey, we're all doing this, and we got a job, and you're part of it, and we expect this out of you. And you know how powerful that is, the peer group when you're 19, 20, 21 years old, especially as a young guy, proving your manhood. I'm every bit as much a man as you, and this is what that means. There's that, but there's also the more positive side of it, fellowship. Very strong ties, very strong bonds of comradeship, fellowship with fellow fighter pilots, with fellow bomber crewmen, and yes, even love. A brotherhood, as I've often called it. There's that. And I think a few of their quotes maybe illustrate the point a little better than I could. This is Hugh Dow, who was a fighter pilot. He said, patriotism had little to do with it, talking about why he did this, at least on the surface. Of course, we all felt strongly what we were doing is right, that we had something to contribute to America's eventual victory. But more important was the feeling of affinity